This is Marcia Fottler at the Historical Society of Sarasota County, and today we're interviewing Robert Fottler for the Ordinary Historian's Oral History Project.
In the middle of a torrent in 1971, over a Labor Day weekend, my wife and I came to Sarasota to investigate a job possibility at Cardinal Mooney High School. We had to cross planking in order to get into the building that had been put down for the purpose of assisting people in avoiding having to swim to that location. So on that weekend, we were interviewed by Father Nick McLaughlin and Sister Christine about our desire to relocate to Sarasota. We were at the time staying with Marcia's parents in Winter Park. Contrast between Boston and Sarasota in the early 1970s was striking. Sarasota was a small town. All of the major institutions here, the newspaper, the bank, were all locally owned. There was no national impact on Sarasota other than the fact that there was still a train station in downtown Sarasota. Most of the shopping was in downtown Sarasota. Montgomery Roberts was down there, a movie theater was down there. It was pre-Sarasota Square Mall. So it is a very different town than the one you see now. Not only was there no University Town Center, there wasn't any other mall around. So the other thing that impressed me about this community when we first came here was how much like Driving Miss Daisy driving was in Sarasota. The people here obviously weren't part of a big city. They drove by being deferential to other drivers on the road, in part because so many of them were aged. And at the time, we were in our late 20s, so for me, dealing with people who drove as if they were competing with snails was something that I was entirely unused to in the world from which I came, where people didn't give anyone an even break. With regard to race and other matters, this town seemed to be in a time warp in which racial integration had had no impact on the people here. Siesta Beach had not one black person on it. Downtown Sarasota, Montgomery Roberts, the movie theaters and so forth had no black people in them. Ringling Shopping Center, which was the first of the shopping centers to be established in Sarasota, had no black people in it. It had a Publix and a Walgreens and a Belk Lindsay and so forth. Everything anyone presumably would need, and it was only 5 minutes from the first home we had here in Sarasota. So a very different world than the one that Sarasota emerged into or became later on. One of the things that happened chronically every decade in Sarasota was that the City Commission would have a study done on how to get people into the downtown area in the evening, since no one lived in the downtown area and it was considered to be dangerous. Older people never went there after 5 o'clock at night. The town shut down. Not only did it shut down after 5, it also shut down for the month of September. The peak of the hurricane season, there were no summer tourists, there were no winter tourists, and businesses in downtown Sarasota simply locked their doors and went away for a month. So very different than the world in which we know there was no interstate highway. Getting into and out of Sarasota required navigating US 41 and US 301 up to Tampa before you could get on a road called I-4 that was obsolete at the time it was completed in the 1960s. So it has only marginally improved since then, even though it's constantly been under reconstruction and expansion. So it's very different than the world in which we know today. It seemed to us in the 1970s and 80s, raising children here, that it was an ideal place to raise kids. They could be outside as much of the time as they wanted to be. You didn't have to put them in heavy winter coats and mittens and galoshes and so forth. This is not part of the world in Sarasota. And as a consequence, they had a kind of ideal upbringing. In the neighborhood that we moved to in the second half of the 1970s, they could be outside playing foursquare with the kids across the street on a regular basis, which they did. With our dog Clipper, who was there for most of their upbringing. They could tumble around the yard with him. It was as nice an upbringing as I can imagine a kid having. On the other hand, when you look at Sarasota for young people, you realize that after they go to college and graduate and so forth, few of them can come back here and make a living. So as a consequence, it may be a wonderful place to raise children, which I think it still is, but on the other hand, once they are raised, there are fewer opportunities for them here than there are in Tampa and Orlando and Atlanta and so forth, which tends to act as a magnet to draw them away, and not especially to the pleasure of their parents. So it's interesting. The kids swam on swim teams. They played, our son played basketball and other sports along the way. So we had an opportunity, particularly since both of them went to the school where I teach, and move on from there to become very happy Florida Gators, which they both graduated. So I think in that time period, as it had been in the 50s and 60s, as I hear from people who raised their children then, this was kind of an ideal town in which to grow up. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same in education. So when I first came here, Cardinal Mooney was a small Catholic school on the outskirts of Sarasota that had been built on a celery farm at the behest of Catholic parents at St. Martha's Church and elementary school. So they wanted a place for their children to get a secondary education. And I suspect that part of the motivation for that was the integration, the racial integration of the town. So Sarasota High School was integrated for the first time in 1967. And Cardinal Mooney had opened it in its present location in 1964. So having been started in a storefront in downtown Sarasota in '59. So they had their campus then on this old celery field, in which they had a main building and a gym that cost a total of $125,000 to construct in 1962-3. So that was the campus, and then they had added some additional portable buildings over the years before I got there in 1971. So they had about 300 students when I got there. At the present time, we have about 500. So the range of enrollment has gone from 250 or so up to 570 or so in that period of time. Public education in Sarasota has always been above average. And part of the reason for that is that parents in this community have shown exceptional interest in education and been willing to fund it. And as a consequence of that, the public schools do a much better job than public schools in some other places. In addition, the demographic in Sarasota tends to be one in which middle and upper middle class people who see education as a route to upward mobility have dominated the school boards over the decades. And as a consequence, have done a very good job. What's changed fundamentally in education is the extent to which more conservative political leaders have intervened in the process for the purpose of trying to increase accountability. It's understandable to the extent that education, public education, is the largest expenditure of state and local government in the United States. And so that those dollars are well spent is certainly something that politicians should have oversight over. The question, of course, is how do you do it? And so what's emerged is a system in which tests, mandatory tests, have become ubiquitous. In every state in the United States, state legislatures have forced on schools a degree of testing that now seems to be over the top, and attempted to apply a private sector model, a capitalist model, to public education in a way that doesn't particularly work. By that I mean they would like to see the pay of individual teachers and the fate of individual schools determined by how the students of those teachers and in those schools do on standardized tests. The problem there is that how kids do on tests often is directly related to the educational achievement of their parents and the interest of two-parent households in seeing that their children have every educational opportunity. So reading to a child from the time they are an infant on every single night is something that enhances the likely educational achievement of the child. And the absence of that, and single-parent households or broken families, as they used to be called, don't seem to do nearly as good a job at that. As a general rule, those who come from poverty often don't have the educational background to begin with, don't necessarily understand how essential that is to the well-being and the opportunities that their children are going to enjoy later on, or don't know how to do it. So for that group in the population, of course, what's going to happen is that the absence of educational attainment is going to push them into an economic subclass that's going to increase the magnitude of difference in income and earnings and life opportunities that has become endemic in American society. So I think testing certainly is one of those things that needs to be very carefully examined. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that if you are conservative and believe in competition, that is the free enterprise model, you believe that more competition among schools has got to work to the betterment of the students, that is the users of the system, the consumers of the product. And as a consequence, the proliferation of charter schools, mostly paid for taxpayers' expense, has a tendency to undermine the efficacy of public education, but at the same time to offer parents greater opportunities for their children. So there's a balancing act there that hasn't been entirely worked out yet. The notion that for-profit schools, whether it's a charter school corporation here out of Virginia or New Jersey, or it happens to be an entity like IMG Academy in Bradenton, is a new phenomenon in the educational scene, as is Phoenix University at the international level, at the national and international level. So the whole notion that for-profit education is something in which we should be engaged is still questionable. Many of those schools, for-profit schools at the higher educational level, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for government subsidized grants and loans to students, and in the absence of which they wouldn't exist. And the users of those loans, the kids who are making use of them, frequently find themselves at the other end with a huge debt and little ability to get a job at the same time. So whether the government ought to be subsidizing such entities is clearly questionable, but it's going to continue so long as those in government, especially at the national level and in Congress, are enamored of the notion that for-profit is always better than pro bono or government-run institutions.